I'm Greg Bamber and speaking from Melbourne, Australia. And when we're having a meeting in Australia, one of the traditions is that we will acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, past, present, and emerging, and recognise that ownership of the land in Australia has never been ceded from their ownership. And I'd like to move on and introduce the format of this webinar, first of all, by thanking Lyra for hosting it. Bernadette and Emily in particular have been beavering away behind the scenes. And we have people from 4 of the countries that are included in the new edition of the International and Comparative Employment Relations book that has just been published, and 4 of the country teams are going to present a 10-minute summary of a few of the current issues in line with the theme adopted in the book in alphabetical order, which is Canada, Germany, South Africa, the United States, and then our distinguished discussant Tom Cochen is going to make sense of everything that he has heard and distill it and discuss it in 10 minutes. And then Ginny from Cornell is going to moderate a discussion and question and answer session. And so if you have any questions or comments along the way, please post them in the chat, and then we'll have an opportunity to discuss after all of the named speakers have presented. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Daphne Tarras from Ryerson University, and she's going to be joined by Scott Walsworth from Saskatchewan, and perhaps by Sean O'Brady from McMaster University, and they're going to give us an insight into employment relations in Canada. Take it away, Canada.
Okay, we are Canada A. We are, Alex Colvin laughed because he was Canadian. We are, in one paragraph, a mature industrial relations system which gave constitutional protection to collective bargaining and the right to strike through some fairly recent Supreme Court decisions. We're about just under 30% unionized, with by far the most membership in the public sector. So that's, in a snapshot, what it took us many pages to write in the chapter. And Scott Walsworth has been introduced, and Sean O'Brady is, I guess, in the same province as me now, Ontario. So I'm in the middle of downtown Toronto, but we've decided in our talk to focus on 3 matters that keep us up at night worrying. And the first matter is the current status of the employed. And like a lot of countries, we know that there's been a real disproportionate effect on gender, on caregivers, and on income earners from the pandemic. That there are some very interesting dynamics from some smaller communities, and there have been some breakouts of COVID in both nursing homes and meatpacking. And I thought I would draw attention to the easy explanation between meatpacking and nursing homes, 2 industries that normally wouldn't be linked except for the pandemic. Low paid and sometimes unpleasant work for new Canadians, especially of color, tend to be for the women in nursing homes and senior care, and for the men in slaughterhouses, because this is an entry into the Canadian economy. But they live together in very congested housing in the towns, so there's no surprise when industries cross-contaminate in seemingly unrelated workplaces. We're seeing in Canada the terror, like you all have, the terror in major cities of people getting into elevators where people are living in rented apartments. There are some major social inequities being brought to the fore that are very visceral during the pandemic. And the only thing that I can say that's worth keeping an eye on as a labor relations response is some movement towards compensating wage differentials. There are some nursing home conglomerates, some retail sector that have offered an extra $2 an hour for people who take on this difficult work, this risky work. So there is some adjustment in the labor market. And there are other signs such as preferred positions in the vaccine lineup priority, which is giving some, social acknowledgement of the stigma and the different leveling in society. So those are interesting things that have come to the fore with regard to the employed. Then we turn to our second point is the most fragile. What has happened with precarious work, job insecurity, income loss, workplace COVID risk, and the right to refuse unsafe work. So in this group of problems, a lot will depend on how quickly the economy will rebound. And we're seeing all this pent-up demand for tourism, for hotels, for restaurants. And we don't know what's going to happen with the rebound and whether things will recalibrate. But there's massive government cushioning through benefits and through employment insurance to tide workers over. So there are a couple of really interesting things that arise from this point. The right to refuse unsafe work will soon be reimagined as the right of workers with compromised immune systems or living with family members with compromised immune systems or particularly difficult family circumstances. And in Canada, there's a move towards family status accommodation, which is not, are you married? Are you single? Do you have children? Do you not have children? But how difficult are your family circumstances? And we're still waiting for the Supreme Court of Canada to rule on how family status discrimination will roll out. But within that, the COVID pandemic response will be an interesting illustration. So I would be watching family status accommodation and the right to refuse unsafe work, and the fact that work for some people is more unsafe than others. It's raised new issues. The third area that we wanted to talk about is the role of unions in the pandemic. And we've seen unions very active, teachers unions calling for school closures, United Food and Commercial Workers calling for a COVID bonus for retail workers. One response is by government. The Ontario government has put a 1% compensation cap on collective bargaining benefits, but it's leaving it to the parties to negotiate exactly how that 1% will roll out. So it's a little bit less a draconian response than what other Ontario provinces did that caused our Supreme Court to react in certain ways, but it's still very concerning, especially when governments are going very deeply into the red. By and large, when I've looked at union movements in Canada, I see opportunistic scrambling rather than any coherent movement among unions or indeed among employers. So I see more of a collective holding of the breath. In Toronto, in major cities, we're working at a furious pace with employers and unions and employees to figure out how to bring about agile workplaces for the pandemic recovery to solve both family status problems, economic problems, and so on. I don't know if other countries in the world are experiencing this, but in Canada, there's a very mysterious rising housing price problem that nobody anticipated. And it makes absolutely no economic sense that everywhere housing prices are going through the roof. But what is happening is a lot of employers are talking about amalgamating locations, allowing employees to work from home, giving freedom and flexibility to employees who were once disciplined for being 15 minutes late 3 times in a row. If you're 15 minutes late, you're going to be called up for discipline. Now, all of a sudden, those restrictions seem to have been gone as long as someone is getting the work done. So the pandemic is revealing things about workflow, how it's measured, how it's monitored, how it's corrected. It's revealing inequities at work within the same job classifications. And certainly in our union movement in Canada, which is a lot pink collar, we'll be entering a new era of close supervision through, the eye in the sky, through Zoom, through electronic surveillance. And so we'll be giving some compensating wage differentials to employees that must appear at the cash register at nursing homes or night cleaning shifts or mining operations. And perhaps we'll be looking at the employees who are given agile workplaces as enjoying more freedoms. I'm not sure whether that will fizzle out as a movement or whether it will be permanently integrated into the Canadian worksite. But I can tell you as a labor relations scholar, I will be looking very carefully at collective agreements in a year or two to see how brand new provisions are being introduced through negotiations. So in closing, those are the three things that are keeping us up at night. I worry about the younger generation having to pay the costs of COVID. And now that I'm particularly gray-haired, I'm looking at my grandchildren as paying for costs. I don't know how unions in a business unionism environment, which is Canada, can actually influence public policy in a way that would redress some of the generational inequities that are going to be caused. So the long-term effects on pensions and benefits is unknown, and the dreadful jolt that we've all experienced, it has implications for the next 50 years, but I'm not sure what's going to happen in labor relations. So, we talked about compensating wage differentials, we talked about collective agreement provisions, but we're still in the middle of it. So that's our Canadian setting. Thank you. And if Scott and Sean need to say anything?
I would just add
They've got 1 minute if they wish to say anything.
Okay, Sean, I'll take 30 seconds. I would just add one point that builds off what Daphne said. And that is just to remind the group that we're very highly unionized in the public sector in Canada, close to 85%, whereas in the public sector, it's closer to 19%. And my sense is that there's a collective sense of dread for the immediate future as governments receive less and less in terms of revenue and are spending more and more. I think there's great concern in the big public sector unions over job security and also on the pressure of wages. And I think there's also a feeling that the general support level for unions in the country is likely going to take a hit in the immediate future.
I would agree with that.
Thanks, Scott. Sean, you've got about 30 seconds.
I'll just add one point too. I think one thing I've seen from somebody who looks at precarious work in Canada is that the pandemic has highlighted the weaknesses of our decentralized bargaining system. So, when you think of grocery stores, there was a hero pay, as we call it, an increase in pandemic pay, which everybody thought, great. This was largely voluntary on the part of employers. Unions might have said it was related to negotiating in some way, but it wasn't. And then the employers rescinded it. Unions fought it like heck. In the Maritimes, there was even a strike related to poor working conditions in a Dominion grocery store. This was a Unifor that did this. But what we've seen is they've actually had almost no influence over the disruptive changes in working conditions from the pandemic. And I would anticipate, and people might speak of this later, that the story would be quite different in other countries. For example, Scandinavian countries or continental European countries where bargaining is more centralized and rights to consultation, worker consultation, are more extensive.
Thank you very much, Daphne, Scott, and Sean. And without having any discussion at this point, let's move the spotlight to Bernd Keller in Germany, who has got a less challenging task in one sense because his co-author is not able to be present with us today, so he's got 10 minutes himself to give us a summary of some of the key developments in employment relations in Germany. And Bernd is a professor emeritus at the University of Constance, and he's co-authored the chapter in the book in the last several editions. So over to you, Bernd.
Yeah, thank you. And good afternoon from Western Europe. Unfortunately, Anja, my co-author, can't make it. Our system of homeschooling is still going on. So this creates a lot of additional problems for all parents. So I'm the only presenter. Greg submitted different subjects for discussion, and I decided to select two. One is part of our national responses to the health pandemic. And I would like to introduce and to discuss with you a very prominent instrument of labor market policy. So let me say just a few words about the present generation. The overall GDP shrank last year by 5.3%. This was almost the amount of shrinkage in the financial and debt crisis in 2008-2009. And this was the most important financial crisis since World War II. One consequence is, and I guess this has also been pointed out for Canada, that sectors were are unevenly affected. So manufacturing is more or less not at all affected, whereas some private service sectors have been hit very seriously. There are even some beneficiaries like supermarkets, like online commerce or delivery services, but it's extremely difficult for hotels, restaurants and bars, cultural and creative industries and parts of retail. So how do we try to cope with the crisis? I do not want to elaborate on higher public expenditure. This is well known from all countries and also for the European level. I would like to mention and to talk a bit about a specific labor market instrument in Germany, and this is called short-term allowance or short-term compensation. And it means payments for employees to compensate for their loss of earnings that result from temporary reductions of weekly working time. This instrument is very old, but it has never been very famous. It's also only of importance during a serious crisis like in 2008, 2009, and now. Payments result from the statutory contributions to the unemployment insurance, and the equivalent is 60 to 67% of your regular pay, and this can increase after 4 or 7 months, and you get this this payment for usually for 12 months, and nowadays the rule has been extended to 24 months. So what does it mean? It creates a so-called win-win situation for both sides. For companies, it means that companies maintain their company-specific know-how, especially experienced men and women power. And after the crisis, companies have no additional hiring costs. For employees, it means that their jobs are saved, that massive layoffs are avoided, and it prevents a significant rise of unemployment and the substitution of income, of course. And more recently, and this is quite interesting, this instrument has been more or less copied by some other European countries. So what do we know about the effects? It's still very early, but there are some preliminary results. So in the spring of 2020, in the spring of last year, about 6 million employees were working short time. This was almost 20% of the total labor force. This number has increased, has decreased during the summer and during the fall, but then it has increased again during the winter and spring up to more than 2 million. But, and this is the effect of the short-term allowance, overall unemployment has only slightly increased. Most recent studies that were published only last week show that about 2.2 million jobs have been saved by this short-term allowance. So this is quite impressive, and the number is supposed to increase towards the end of the crisis. So this does, and this is my final point in this part, this does not mean that there are no present problems. One problem is, of course, that this instrument is fairly expensive, and it is paid for by regular contributions to the unemployment insurance, and if this is not enough, by public subsidies. But anyhow, these payments are much lower than payments for high unemployment would be, and there is no doubt about this proportion. There are still problems for low wage earners. I guess this is again comparable with Canada, and this problem has to be solved, for example, by a higher substitution rate for these low wage earners. An interesting or final unresolved interesting problem is that these timeframes could be used for additional training. And we know from preliminary empirical results that this does not happen, but we don't know really why it doesn't happen. So it is quite obviously that there is an urgent need for additional qualification of training. There is working time left to do this training, but it doesn't happen. And we have to find out why this is the problem. Okay, this is one point I would like to mention and probably to discuss with you. The other point has to do with the impact of digitalization on work. And this is, of course, a very broad topic. The interesting point I would like to mention has to do with co-determination in Germany. I do not want to elaborate on necessary trade union activities in collective bargaining and so on. This could easily be the topic for another webinar. I would like to talk about German works councils, and I guess everybody knows, and you have probably read our chapter, that this is the focal ingredient of this dual structure of German industrial relations. The history of works councils goes back to the Weimar Republic, to the 1920s, and the law for the present situation was passed in 1972 and has not really been upgraded since then. Now the pandemic shows very clearly that it needs a basic upgrade in two different regards. One is the introduction of digitalization measures in the existing economy. And it's quite obvious that instruments that were introduced in the Fordist times and Fordist regime of production are not sufficient anymore. The other reason is the forthcoming introduction of the platform economy. And this part of the economy is definitely more or less completely unregulated. And we need to introduce some basic rules for co-determination issues in the platform economy. So the draft of this so-called Works Councils Modernization Act has been introduced in federal parliament. It's within the political process, and a decision has to be made pretty soon because our next general election will take place in September, and the process has to come to its end before the summer. So let me just mention a couple of points that might be of interest without going into too many details. And whoever is going to write a chapter on Germany for the 8th edition of ECIR will have to rewrite this part on co-determination from scratch. So one point is the felicitating the establishment and election of works councils. So coverage rates of works councils are down to 40%. And this rate has, of course, to be increased, and election procedures are fairly complicated and have to be made very easy. The second point is the simplification of digital work. And this is so far completely unregulated. This would include things like video conferences for works councils, electronic signatures for documents. It would also include another or a further extension of the concept of companies and also of employees. So all these gig and cloud workers have to be included one way or the other, and they are completely excluded now. It would also mean that works councils have to have more rights in continuous training and further training. And the idea of the draft is that they should be able to take the initiative to introduce measures of continuous and further training. Artificial intelligence is, of course, another broad field, and quite in general, the regulatory framework we need for mobile work, and this is more important or has become more important during the pandemic than it has been before. The problem, and this is the end of my remark, is that coverage rates are fairly low. As I mentioned, they are at about 40% now, and they have decreased since the early mid-1990s. And even if we manage to pass this draft, it will only cover less than half of the present workforce, and nobody knows what is going to the other half. Anyhow, this pillar and this constituent part of German industrial relations will be changed very soon, and we'll have to find out during one of the forthcoming seminars what possible consequences will be. So that's what I have to say. Thanks for listening.
Dankeschön. Thank you, Bernd. And there seem to be some interesting changes taking place in Germany. We had a LIRA webinar only a year ago where there was some discussion about the responses to the pandemic, and it was a very different picture that Ginny presented then of Germany compared with the picture that you have painted today. But perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion, and let's move along now to South Africa, which is included in the 7th edition of our book for the first time. And it's a pleasure to welcome two of the South African contributors to join us in this webinar, both from the University of Cape Town, Johan Marie and Asanda Jonas Benya. And some of us were lucky enough to visit the University of Cape Town on one or more occasions when it hosted meetings of the International Labour and Employment Relations Association, which is the international umbrella body that LIRA and other national associations belong to. So Johan and Asanda, please take it away and enlighten us about South Africa. And I think you're going to share your screen, Johan, with us.
I am going to share my screen. I'm going to do that now. And once I'm afraid my system stopped and it had to resume again. So I hope it doesn't happen again. But I'm now going to share my screen with you. And you should now all have a full view of it. I'm going to just let me do a little bit more here. I'm going to talk about labour and employment relation challenges in South Africa. Since it's the first time South Africa is in the book, and I'm going to give some background just on the country and on its employment relation systems and how it's come to be what it is. From there, I want to cover what is a major development, and we're all holding our breath as to what's going to happen, and I'll reveal to you as I speak what that is. Then I'm going to cover a topic that I'm very glad Barend also covered. I'm going to talk about the South African effort to implement the equivalent of co-determination and works councils here. Finally, I'm going to say a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 in terms of global supply chain. But the main coverage of what COVID-19's effect is on South Africa, especially the sort of economic and social effects, Asanda will cover, and she'll also deal with the gender issues in South Africa. So without more ado, South Africa is the second largest economy in Africa after Nigeria. But it does have the most industrialized and diversified economy in Africa. And probably, as you can see there, the manufacturing constitutes 16% of value added to our gross domestic product. And it was much larger, but as happens in most more developed countries, the services start taking over and become bigger. So trade is 14%. Mining, which used to be very big, has shrunk a bit to 7%, and agriculture to 2.5%. And the two largest sectors are finance and services in the South African economy in terms of value added to the GDP. South Africa has a population of 59 million people, and it is a multicultural society. And that's an important thing to bear in mind, as Black Africans make up 80%, so 81%, so the overwhelming proportion of the population. Coloreds, that would be a term people are not familiar with, but in South Africa, colored people call themselves coloreds, and they're a community. They are the descendants of the original Khoi and San indigenous. A lot of them now call themselves Bushmen, the original San. And also the result of slaves from the descendants of slaves from Asia, and they've come to make up a community. They make 9% whites, who are the descendants of settlers from Europe, mostly Britain and Holland, 8%, and then Indians and Asians, people from Asian origin, make 2% of the population. And there are very big cultural differences. Colored people, although they've come from indigenous stem, are mostly Afrikaans speaking, which is what half of the whites speak, more or less, and their culture is very different from other groups' cultures. So that is just an important factor to bear in mind when dealing with South Africa. To go to employment relations, the background of it is that it was the discovery of diamonds and of gold in the late 19th century that really started, as it were, the employment relation system we have today, and the employment system, because it initiated migrant labor that has persisted up to the present time. That the mine owners, and some of them became very big and rich and wealthy, they recruited and became big corporations, mining houses. They recruited African labor from South African so-called reserves, where whites never really settled and were dominated by blacks, and also neighboring states, especially Mozambique, but also Zimbabwe and Zambia and so on. And they had a monopoly in recruiting, so this labor was unskilled and was very cheap. On the other hand, there was skilled labor was needed in the mines, and they were recruited from Britain and Australia. And these skilled white mine workers quickly formed guilds and unions to limit their supply. Yes, to limit their supply and keep expensive. In 1922, there was a revolt when the employers tried to replace black with white workers. And as a result of that revolt, the Industrial Conciliation Act was passed that introduced industrial councils, but it excluded African workers, African male workers from industrial councils, so they couldn't participate in the industrial councils. Now fast forward from 1924 to 1994 with our political transformation to a constitutional democracy, with a Bill of Rights that gave workers a right to form and join a trade union and to strike. And the new government passed the Labor Relations Act of 1995, that kept industrial councils but changed them to bargaining councils. And the big thing is that they were extended full rights to form unions and to strike to the public service workers for the first time. And those unions have grown very large and very strong. And now fast forward to 2021, and the current public service unions are negotiating their wages and working conditions with the state. Now, a background is that the South African state, due to a combination of incompetence and corruption, has gone into enormous debts. It's about 200 billion US dollars. It's a phenomenal figure in South Africa. And the Minister of Finance announced a wage freeze. It was supposed to pay a wage increase for a 3-year agreement, and just said we're going to have a wage freeze. And of course, there was immediate outcry from the public service, and they threatened to go on strike. And negotiations are still taking place, and it all takes place on one bargaining council, the Public Service Coordinating Bargaining Council. And according to the General Secretary of that council, 98% is highly unionized, and over time they have increased their wages and their employment enormously. So they have everything from an 18% to 30% higher wage than the private sector. But in negotiations, the deadlock was reached soon, and the Minister of Public Service, heading it the state side, asked for the public to comment to look for solutions. And we now have a conciliator from the ILO who is trying to reach a settlement, but we think it's to no avail, and we are holding our breath as 1.3 million public service workers right across the country might go on strike soon. And it's going to have a devastating effect. No police, no teachers, no medical staff, except of course for emergency workers. But that is a major concern at the moment in this country. The other thing is I want to touch on co-determination, that an innovation in the Labour Relations Act was the introduction of workplace forums, which are based on the German co-determination system of works councils. And the person who played a very big role, or played a role certainly in it, was no other than Professor Manfred Weiss, the former president of ILERA. He served actually on the drafting team of the Labour Relations Act of 1995. The unions were represented, and they tried to make it as acceptable to the unions as possible. But unlike Germany, where the unions embraced works council, as Brent Keller pointed out, 40% of private sector workforce are currently covered by them, South African unions have rejected workplace forums. And research, I've done some research, and other research show that over the past 24 years, only 128 applications to register workplace forums have been submitted. And research to try and find one that's working has now of late not produced a single one. We cannot find a single workplace forum that exists and is functional in the country.
Johan,
my time up. I'm already, yes. I'm so sorry. I'll stop there. Okay. Over to Asanda.
Thank you, Johan. All very interesting, and you of course elaborate these arguments much more in your chapter in the book, which people can refer to. Asanda, welcome. Lovely to see you.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks to the colleagues who've already spoken. I think I'm going to just go straight to the COVID-19 impact on work, because I'm not going to touch on gender because we already do not have time. But just to say that when in the book, we talk about gender equity in South Africa, and I think part of the points we're making in the book is how the conception of equity in our employment relations or employment legislation has been very narrow. And I'm not going to go into that. I think I'll just focus on the impact of COVID-19 in South Africa. But I think one, to understand and to appreciate maybe the impact of COVID-19 in the country, one has to take a a somewhat longer view and not just look at 2020 or use 2020 as a starting point. The fact that we are one of the most unequal countries in the world, we've been battling HIV, TB, diabetes, and other comorbidities for the past 20 or so years, even before the 20 or so years. The socioeconomic realities of the country, and also, especially rather for African household, I think these are things that one needs to sort of keep in mind as we talk about the impact of COVID-19. I think it was Canada earlier that talked about the disproportionate impact that it has had on women in the country. It has also had a disproportionate impact on African households. So things like social distancing or physical distancing, sanitation, how do you do that when you don't have proper housing, but also how do you do that when you don't have running water? So it was really impractical for people to observe these COVID protocols because of the communities that people live in. And of course, the ailing public healthcare system, and especially in our rural towns. But most importantly for workers, I think what is important to keep in mind also is that for South Africa, by the end of 2019, the economic growth rate was already very, very slow, if not stagnant. That's what economists say. We were already in a technical recession by the third quarter of 2019. And some people are saying this technical recession, it has been worse, not just bad, but worse than even the 2008, 2009 recession that we saw. So when we had a lockdown in March 2020, we were also facing what some saw as the inevitable downgrading of the South African economy by Moody's. And indeed, shortly after we went into the lockdown, the downgrade was confirmed. And so these are things that I think are very important to keep in mind as we think about the impact of COVID-19, the fact that the country was downgraded a week after lockdown, and then we shut down everything, and the impact then in light of all of that. And obviously the disproportionate impact on poor and working class households. In fact, less than 2 months after lockdown, in South Africa, about 3 million people lost their jobs, and most of these were women. Some didn't lose jobs, but they lost income because households and jobs were closed. So one thing to point out is that it was not just women and these working class households that were impacted, but also migrants from the region. So while the president, as a way of mitigating some of the impact of COVID-19, they introduced certain ways of helping. Well, the emergency, for instance, the 500 billion emergency rescue package, which was about $26.3 billion US dollars. Some of this went into healthcare, but some of it actually went into workers. So we had the unemployment insurance fund that was that put together or developed the COVID-19 temporary employee relief scheme. So this was specifically targeting employees and employers. We also had things like the social grants that were distributed to about 10 million households, unemployed people rather, not households. And this helped in terms of reducing the number of households that went hungry. While there was this money that was provided by the government, there's been lots of people saying that it was badly implemented, and obviously also corruption. So despite these measures then by government, when one thinks about the impact of COVID-19 on people, despite these measures by the government, unemployment has not been abated rather. So we've seen in the past quarter, for instance, statistics that were released a couple of weeks ago showing that, if anything, the unemployment rate has been going up in the country, again, emphasizing the impact of that on youth, on Black people, and women especially. And also, if you unpack the statistics, you see that it's particular jobs or particular sectors that have been hardest hit, with those consumer-facing services sector being those that are hardest hit. There's a lot that one can, there's a lot that we talk about in the chapter, and there's no time, unfortunately, to go through that. But just as a way of concluding, is that what for us in South Africa, what started off as an economic outcome that was worse than the 2008-2009 recession, it's actually turned out into a nightmare. And some economists argue that it is the worst economic downturn in the country since the Great Depression in the 1930s. While our macroeconomic problems in South Africa are structural, historical, these have all been exacerbating our challenges and ability to wade through the crisis. the people who've been the most affected are also the biggest shock absorbers of all of these crises that I've just talked about, in addition to COVID-19. I think I'll end it there and hand back over to you, Greg. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sander and Johan. And forgive me hurrying you up, but there's some interesting things coming out of these remarks to discuss. And we mustn't forget the United States, which is where most of the people on this call are located. And we're very fortunate in having the two contributors from the United States to the last several editions of the book, who are both with us today. One is a former dean and provost at Cornell of the ILR school, and one is the current dean of the ILR school. And the clue is the current dean has the picture of the ILR school behind him as he's speaking. The former dean's looking very relaxed, lying back. And I think the former dean, Harry's going to go first briefly and then leave some time for Alex to follow on. Is that right?
Just to reverse, Alex is going to go first.
Okay.
Well, it's, yeah. I'm also noticing that clearly Daphne and I both went to Dean School because we're advertising our schools in our backdrops. Shout out to Rutgers there. So in the United States, there's some underlying trends that in our chapter we talk about that we've really seen continue over the last period. And the two big ones are this kind of relatively weak collective representation. We all know the story of kind of lower unionization that has declined over time in the United States, but really development of this characteristically individualized employment relations system in the United States, and at the same time an increasing legalization of the American system, and that's a really important part of the story in the United States. And we've really seen that continuing just in this most recent period. On the legalization part, there's two decisions we talk about in the chapter. The Janus decision that dealt with the question of public sector agency clauses. And essentially, the Supreme Court decided that in the public sector in the United States, a national right to work law was essentially going to be created by the courts. And it's sort of a remarkable thing to think about, right? The breakdown of the American public policy formation system in the labor realm, right? We have a labor statute that dates back to the 1930s and 40s, and we've seen relatively little success in public policy updating. But we've seen the courts stepping in and changing things based on kind of development of legal doctrines. And Janus is a massive kind of indicator of the court's willingness to step in and craft legal doctrines that have really profound labor relations impacts. Now, interestingly, it was less far-reaching than I think some of us in the field feared. There was certainly some discussion that it might end up creating a kind of national right to work standard, saying that you could not have any kind of agency arrangement where workers represented by unions in a collective bargaining agreement could be charged for representation fees for that representation. It was confined to the public sector, though in America currently, similar to Canada but a lower level, public sector labor relations is about half of the American unionized workforce, and a much higher unionization level, retaining unionization of just over 30%, versus we're seeing down to around 6% private sector unionization. The interesting thing with Janus that we saw in the fallout is both kind of the impact of legal changes, but also the limitations of them. There was a lot of workers paying these agency fees beforehand. Most of them stopped paying the agency fees, but we didn't see public sector union members dropping their memberships and stopping paying dues. And that was a really interesting outcome after Janus, and something that the unions have been very afraid of, and actually did a very successful effort to bolster membership support to reach out to their members. Was one of the kind of positive side effects of it. But I think also reflected the research that's been done showing that most American union members are very satisfied with their union membership, appreciate the value of that. The second major legal decision is Epic Systems, and this deals with mandatory arbitration, a really big phenomenon in the US that now covers over half of American non-union employees, where their individual employment rights have to be resolved through an employer-established system of arbitration rather than going to the public courts. A privatization of justice, and privatization, I guess, is another American theme of labor employment relations, private structures and the weakness of the public sector. The significant thing from labor relations standpoint is that this also suggests a court move away from support for collective rights. There's a weakening in it of our Section 7 rights for collective action. So again, this American trend toward individualization driven by the courts being a really big theme there. The other aspect I'm going to touch on that's related to this kind of legalization aspect in America is around the digitalization of work, right? This theme that Bernd was talking about in the German context. In America, this has been a big legal debate around the status of gig economy workers, whether they have employment rights or not. And really ground zero for this has been in California, where California, initially the courts crafted a broader definition of who's an employee, what we call the ABC test. It's sort of a simpler test that more broadly recognizes kind of the economic realities of the situation in classifying workers as being employees and having employment rights. This is then followed by the California legislature passing basically a codification of the ABC test and a statute called AB5. And then quite a remarkable reaction last fall where the rideshare companies, Uber and Lyft, launched a massive campaign to exempt themselves from this. They got a proposition passed, Proposition 22, that I guess apparently was the largest singly funded proposition in California history. They took about $200 million into this and successfully got this proposition passed by the voters. In weird American style, this only applies to rideshare drivers. So they're the only part of the gig economy that gets out of the rules. For the rest of workers, gig economy workers, the ABC test, AB5 still applies. So it's almost like private exemption from government regulation. Strange, but very American. The latest update on this is that New York State, there's been reports of discussion going on currently between some unions and Uber and Lyft to come up with a sort of quasi-sectoral bargaining alternative to regulation of the drivers as employees. It's not clear exactly what this involves because it's being secretive. It has not been released what the proposal is, and there's a lot of skepticism in the community about whether this is actual sectoral bargaining or not and what exactly it will involve. But this is the latest thing going on in this respect. Maybe I'll stop there and pop over to Harry to follow on.
Thanks, Alex. Let me just first thank Greg and the other co-editors both for putting together this webinar and for the hard work involved in herding we faculty cats with a CATS cats into this kind of comparative volume, which is no simple task. So what I'm going to highlight is just a few developments that sort of pick up on some of the things Alex has mentioned that focus in particular on recent developments and trends in union strength, the strength of collective bargaining, and also the strength of collective actions that may not necessarily involve unions and collective bargaining. So first, on the private sector side, as Alex has highlighted, private sector unionism is at an extremely low level, 6.5%. And here's my point, is even in the face of extremely innovative efforts at organizing, there's no sign of an imminent spurt in growth in private sector unionism overall. We now, many would say, fortunately have a president that openly endorses collective bargaining and unionization. Many of us were looking at the recent vote of Amazon workers in Bessemer, Alabama, as sort of an interesting test to see if, with the encouragement of the president and the other things going on in our economy, we would see a vote for representation. And that vote not only failed, but it failed overwhelmingly. Now, some would argue that's all because those difficulties are all because of the deficiency and limitations in our law. There's currently an effort, it's called the PRO Act, to change the law. I have two things personally to comment. I won't speak for Alex on this. I think it's very unlikely the PRO Act will pass Congress. And I also wonder, even if it did pass, I'm not so convinced it would lead to the enormous turnaround in private sector membership that the labor movement hopes for. Let me turn to something a bit more optimistic, and that is signs of life in collective action in the United States, where if you would just look at the private sector membership numbers, you would not suspect there is so many signs of life. One is, just to elaborate on an important point Alex mentioned, even in the face of the Janus decision by the courts, and financial pressures in the public sector union membership has held up rather strongly. It's in the mid-30s at the local and state level. It's also held up at the federal level. So even in the face of those challenges, public sector unionism has been quite strong. Secondly, even outside of formal unionism in the public sector, particularly for teachers, many of us were struck by the wildcat strike action that took place a couple of years ago, starting, and then it's still occurring in some places in states, West Virginia and Oklahoma, and among them, where unionism is not strong. We've seen teachers, again, often acting outside the boundary of unionism and collective bargaining, taking rather strong collective action and achieving some gains in terms of forcing legislative changes that improve pay and working conditions for public sector teachers and all. A third point, it's not just teachers. There are many rights groups that have formed in the United States. Many of us, some would say us collective bargaining geezers, I'll speak personally for that regard, not project out onto Alex, would criticize us for being so focused on unions and collective bargaining. And many of us are waking up, being dragged by our more innovative, often younger colleagues, to recognize all the collective actions that are occurring, not just by teachers, but by many others outside forms of unions and collective bargaining. That involves taxi drivers, a taxi driver alliance, home care workers, other healthcare workers, farm workers, the Immokalee Coalition among them, many other collective actions ongoing. Questions remain as to whether those actions will get institutionalized, how long they can survive, whether they will lead, as early public sector unionism did, to eventual collective bargaining and unionism. But the fact of the matter is those rights groups are acting collectively and in some cases achieving noteworthy gains. Again, they're often, not always, often linked to immigrant rights issues, which are really important, and many of them are troubling in the United States. A fourth point, I just want to return sort of the basic collective bargaining and also say, some private sector unions are alive and well. Professional sports, we often overlook it, heavily unionized, high-paid athletes bargaining collectively, using their grievance procedure to protect them. Pandemic issues, a number of unions stepped up and did important things for workers in their jurisdiction. Auto workers, the AFT and the NEA who represent school teachers, the SEIU and others who represent healthcare workers, the UFCW in trying to protect workers who work in retail stores and also some meatpacking and all. Important actions often taken at the shop floor level to force management to provide personal protective equipment and do other steps that provide health and safety protections. Of course, we all wish there were even more of those. We wish the past administration had been more aggressive the new administration, fortunately, is itself in OSHA and other through agency activity being more aggressive. But again, unions have played a really important, helpful role. Another point, sort of stepping outside collective bargaining, even beyond this kind of workplace collective action, there's been important legislative gains. Again, many of us, leaders, myself included, were quite skeptical that the labor movement could promote improvements in the minimum wage through the fight for 15. Enormous success, again, varied across states. Another point Alex mentioned too, and just to build on, very varied action at state level. Some states passing legislation, not just about the minimum wage, but in other arenas. But anyway, back to my basic point, important collective action, legislative action. Again, we don't think of the United States as being a showcase for that kind of legislative political action, but there have been important changes. And last but not least, just to mention one last point about the pandemic, there were very significant federal actions taken that were not typical of the United States. There was a federal support for unemployment insurance, which is typically driven and financed at the state level with enormous variation in the benefits and coverage that workers receive. Well, Congress passed several bills that provide substantial federally provided financial support. Now, there's great debate about the levels of that, the consequences of that, but one shouldn't overlook the fact that this was quite novel for the United States, for the federal government to be so active. The federal government was also active, fortunately, due to the strength of the Democrats in Congress, to provide parental leave and sick leave. The United States stands out, as many of you know, among the so-called advanced countries for not being advanced in the kind of national legislation that exists regarding parental and sick leave. But there were some important measures adopted as part of the pandemic relief initiatives. And of course, it remains to be seen. One can be hopeful there. I think that it's possible that the election of Joe Biden and the changes that have occurred in the Congress can be built upon in the next elections, and we may well see further legislative action that would be meaningful to extend those kinds of federal benefits and make us look a bit more like the social democratic countries that are covered in the comparative volume. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Harry and Alex, for enlightening us about the United States. And I'd like to pass the baton to our good friend, Tom Cochin, who I've been lucky enough to work with on several projects, one of which was in the airline industry that you didn't mention, Harry, in your areas, which are highly unionized, at least in some of the parts of the aviation sector in the United States, another sector that's been, of course, devastated by the pandemic, and where the federal government has intervened, as I understand it also. But let me now pass to Tom, who's kindly agreed to make some discussant remarks. Over to you, Tom. Thank you. And I should say, I guess Tom really needs no introduction, but just in case there's anyone who doesn't know that Tom is the professor of employment relations at the MIT Sloan School, but I think is in the process soon of transitioning to become an emeritus professor at MIT Sloan.
Well, thank you, Greg. You know, this concept of emeritus, this is just a fancy word for saying you stop getting a paycheck, but you can continue to work and do what you want to do. So that's my definition of whatever this damn transition is going to be. This has been such a rich discussion, and the book itself is a major, major contribution. I'm going to make comments first a little bit about the evolution of this volume from the first to the seventh edition. And then I want to focus on this rich discussion that took place here today, which is really pointing to where our field is going. And I'm going to then end up with a term that I've just invented, that we have a Humpty Dumpty problem in this field that's going to have to be addressed in the eighth edition. And those of you who have children and grandchildren know that there's this children's story about Humpty Dumpty where the pieces fall apart and somebody's got to put them back together. That's where I think we are right now. We're experiencing a breakup of a lot of our concepts and our ideas and the focus, and it's going to take the next edition and the next generation of scholars in our field to put it back together in a coherent way. But let me start with a comment about the book that brings us all together. This is, clearly the premier comparative employment relations book of our time. It's gone through an evolution of 7 editions. I think I was there to watch the first one. And basically what it's done over time is it's moved from comparison of national system. Yes, you still have South Africa, or newly introducing South Africa, Germany, the US, Canada, and so on. But the focus that used to be on comparing these national systems has really moved on. And it's moved on incrementally over these 7 editions. As new research, you mentioned the airline industry, Greg, as we've done comparisons with industry focus across national boundaries, and you see that sectoral emphasis embedded in more and more in recent editions. The work that Harry and Oban Derbyshire did to really emphasize that we can compare particular issues and see commonalities, but yet divergencies, and that more micro analysis is apparent in my reading of the chapters of the book, the work that Rose Bott and then Jenny has carried on in terms of looking at a particular sector like call centers, and then comparing across and learning from all of those. Those are all the rich pieces that now are informing the way the book has evolved and the way in which our authors are addressing these issues. And I think that's a real contribution. We're moving from national comparative systems without much of a conceptual framework to then debating whether varieties of capitalism, for all its contributions and its warts, is a framework, or whether we have to use growth models, as some of our colleagues. And so we're still searching for frameworks that will allow for systematic comparison across national levels. But the real focus is going much, much, much more to micro level institutional developments. And then I'm going to suggest even beyond the institutions. I think that's the real contribution of your volume. Over the years, we're indebted to you, and it gets richer and richer with new and emerging scholars, younger people coming in, as we've seen on this this program here today. That's a tribute to the work. Now, what I'd like to pivot then to is look what happened here today. This conversation, rich conversation, almost was independent of the content in the chapters in the book, because everyone is so focused today on what are we learning from this disruptive experience of COVID, the disruptive experience of recognizing the essential nature of work that's being done by low-wage workers, by immigrants, by people of color, by women, the growing role of gender equity and racial equity, and the social identities that people carry into the workplace, whether they're immigrants. That all came out in the conversation here today. And I would say it's kind of moving beyond the institutional focus that is so much a part of our field, looking at, yes, the co-determination, looking at the labor movement, looking at collective bargaining. But unless those institutions are going to be able to learn from and adapt in a post-COVID period, then we're going to see a continued decline of those institutions. And I think the conversation from Germany and South Africa and Canada and the US all emphasize that the institutions of collective bargaining are under tremendous stress. Works councils and co-determination need a new act and a new way of thinking about it. The public sector in South Africa is falling apart and maybe facing a crisis. And as Daphne and colleagues said, in Canada, we're seeing similar kinds of pressures and pressures to respond more effectively to a world where there's a gig economy, where there's digitalization of our practices, where there are new entrants and new players that don't fit well with the existing structures, and new forms of collective action. That's the Humpty Dumpty dimension. All of these are really the central debating points in our field. And whether we will be able to see our institutional arrangements and our laws really get updated to cope with these realities and these things that are driving what's going on in our workplace today, or not, is going to be the defining question of our field moving forward. And I think the defining features that will show up in the 8th edition of this fantastic book. So I look forward to this. I think we do face some really tough choices in our field, both from a policy standpoint, from an institutional innovation standpoint, and from a scholarly standpoint. We are a field that has always moved across those boundaries. We are having debates in the United States about whether there will be some form of labor law change. I agree with Harry. There's little prospect that the existing bill is going to go anywhere. And even if it did, that it would have much of an effect. That we have to have much more fundamental change in our policies and our institutions. There are lots of interesting developments occurring in the regulatory side that may push us toward things that I never thought could happen, that we might have some new sectoral arrangements, call them wage boards, call them safety and health committees in your state of New York, Alex and Harry, that I think just got safety and health committee legislation passed. I don't know where that's going, but those are going to be the issues our young colleagues will be addressing in the future. I think they're going to move our field forward. I think it's going to be much more from a bottoms up, looking at these individual experiences around gender, social identity, essential workers, inequality of experience and opportunities for what we now call essential workers. Those things are going to drive people, our students, to really re-engage the field. And they will then ask, are the institutions up to the challenge of addressing these issues? And if not, then either we go beyond the institutions or we fundamentally reform them. I think those are the debates that are in front of us. I think it's an exciting time. I think this volume and the collection of authors have really done us a great service in highlighting them. And this discussion tells us where we need to go as we move forward on all of these issues. So thank you for the chance to listen and to read and to comment.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to hand over to Ginny now, who is one of the bright younger colleagues who's joined the team for this edition as co-editor of the book and made an added value to the team greatly. So, and Ginny's going to moderate the discussion now. So Ginny, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Greg. And thank you for Bernadette and Emily for helping to organize this, and all of our presenters for really stimulating, thoughtful presentations. I have been looking at the chat and I've seen a lot of comments and a couple of questions. So I will just, I think because there are just a couple of actual questions, I'll call on those two people and suggest that the presenters look at the comments and see if there's anything in there that you would like to respond to as well in your comments. So the first one is from Joel Gershenfeld. Joel, would you like to pose your question directly?
Sure, I'm delighted to do so. In a sense, my question follows on from Tom's comments, which is that it was stunning to hear in every case how the institutions are not being agile and adaptive in the current climate. And we heard from Harry a little bit of hope and optimism of some alt labor developments and even some traditional developments in responding to COVID. But I guess my question for any of the panelists is, do they see in any innovations what we call bright spots? You know, it might not be an entire new architecture for labor and employment relations, but what we call weak signals, early indicators that they would like to lift up as potentially pointing the way towards what will be needed for working institutions in the 21st century.
Thanks, Joel. And then I have another question from Stephen Sylvia. Would you like to ask your question, Stephen?
Sure. Hi, Ginny. So my question is, it sort of follows on Joel's about the question of innovation. And one of the things that struck me, it may have been just the presentations focused on things and didn't get to this point. But one of the things that's striking me is that given the economic impact and the workplace impact that we're going to see from climate change when it comes to electrification of cars, when it comes to air transport, and when it comes to things like a recent German Supreme Court decision, which is forcing the German government to specify exactly how they're going to meet climate goals, that the issue of the impact of climate change on work is substantial and will really reorganize everything. And I didn't really hear all that much about how employment relations institutions in general, unions in particular, are dealing with that issue.
Okay, thanks. And I would love to take more questions, but since we only have 10 more minutes and we have a lot of presenters to answer, I will ask my own final question and then turn it over to all of you to answer. This question really regards going beyond the comparative lens. So in our book, in our conclusion, we try to not just talk about comparative developments, but think about international employment relations within multinational firms and across their value chains. This was sort of mentioned by a couple of the presenters, but not really explored in great detail. And I was listening to the news in Germany the other day, and I heard that the Bundestag is voting on this Lieferkettungsgesetz, which is going to focus on provide new responsibilities for companies to monitor conditions across their supply chain. So I wonder for Bernd, if he could reflect on this or make a few comments if he has any, and for others, do you see implications under COVID for these supply chain policies of companies in your countries? Is there anything for us to understand and those kinds of implications? So that's it. And I will now turn it over to maybe we'll go backwards and have the US team give your final comments in response to questions or points raised by Tom.
I yield to Alex.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll go in reverse and come on Stephen's question first. So the climate debate stuff has been interesting, right? That in the United States, there's been a significant segment of the labor movement that's been part of the kind of blocking coalition against climate action, and so you've seen this debate within the labor movement. It's been interesting following it in New York State, which is where I've been most familiar with that. And we have a unit within the ILR school that's been working with the labor movement within the state to try to get a kind of union position around climate jobs that's constructive in climate action with some success, right? It's been interesting seeing that there's been a increasing move to kind of pull together a coalition, including building trades unions in the New York City, greater New York City area, in support of climate jobs for New York State and getting behind offshore wind, as well as other climate jobs action within the state. But it's been clearly a big struggle, right? And this is I think being fought out very much at kind of a local level and between particular unions, underneath the kind of national conversation. So so in one sense it's kind of hopeful that there is, I see some of this action going on, but at the same point, for somebody who's, if you're concerned about getting quick action, right? I mean, it's a slow moving process, and there's still this kind of opposition around it.
The climate change and environmental.
And then just to pick up on Tom's comments around, where we are seeing some more kind of innovative action going on, right? I echo Harry's comments that we are seeing some interesting kind of coalitions around kind of collective or semi-collective action, but I think we have to think about it differently. The thing that really struck me in the fall was we saw Prop 22 being passed in California, but we also saw a Fight for 15 based $15 an hour minimum wage proposition being successful in Florida, a state that Biden lost and the Democrats did poorly in. And yet, by a significant margin, this $15 an hour minimum wage passed. And it was interesting that the key funding behind it came from a plaintiff attorney, a very wealthy plaintiff attorney in Florida, who basically was the guy who got this on the ballot and pushed it through. And so, I think that kind of forces us a little bit to rethink who the actors are. I mean, that probably did more for worker wages in the United States than anything unions have done in the last couple of years, right? The Fight for 15 campaigns has been the real surprise here. Sometimes the unions have been pushing that. I think in California and New York, the union action is key in getting those $15 an hour minimum wage things passed, but they're popping up over the course over the country, and they're including some of these new actors who were traditionally not part of our kind of vision of the field, right? These plaintiff attorneys are really big actors in America, and they traditionally weren't who we focused on. So, I'm kind of with Tom's thought that the next generation of research needs to really start looking at some of these alternative people acting on behalf of labor and employees that were outside of our kind of ambit of thinking in the past.
Great, thanks. So now over to Johan and Asanda.
Asanda, do you have any answer? Otherwise, I'll do an answer.
Well, I mean, a short one, I suppose, to the climate change. I've already written on the chat box that in my view, and I suppose I'm also simplifying the narrative of unions in South Africa, that not much has been done in terms of concrete work in really unpacking and dealing with the impact of climate change on workers. Research has been commissioned, and unions, in my view, they talk the talk, but in terms of concrete work that needs to happen, I've not seen much. Yes, there's been links between unions and social movements, and all of them advocating for renewable energies, but not much beyond that.
Yeah. Yes, if carry on, or otherwise I can add to that. Okay. What I find is the unions are very concerned about loss of jobs, especially with regard to climate change, because most of our energy is still coal energy, and we need to switch desperately to solar and wind energy, and bring in private providers to help with Eskom as a national organization. But the major union is concerned about loss of jobs. And then there's also an ideological divide. They're very socialist and communist even oriented, and they want central state control, and they don't want privatization. So that also, they oppose the private sector coming into Eskom, which is our national state energy provider. So that's moving. We're moving very, very slowly away from coal electricity production to clean energy production. And sadly to say, the union is one of the biggest obstacles, but not the only one. the major union is also in a federation, is also in a tripartite alliance with the ruling party, and many people in the ruling party are also of the same sort of socialist orientation and not in favor of private sector. But there is big division within our ruling party between those who are supporting private sector and those who are still terribly opposed to bringing the private sector on board. Then the second point I want to make about the question from, I think, Joel, about is there any hopeful signs? Ironically, what we really need in South Africa is workplace forums, our works councils to get going. And we need to change the legislation to make it favorable, more favorable for unions, because as I see, the workplace forums bring about harmony, as ways of common sitting down and solving problems together. Whereas I'm afraid our collective bargaining is terribly adversarial. There's both a class and a race differential already, and it often ends in strikes and sometimes violent strikes with lots of destruction of property even. And so we need to develop some form of works council where both sides acknowledge their interdependence on each other and they look for common solutions to problems, as opposed to at the moment we hammer it out through adversarial bargaining and try to beat the other side. Thank you.
All right, in our last 2 minutes, some quick comments from Bernd, and then we'll move back to the Canada team. Bernd? Bernd, you're muted.
Okay. Well, first on Joel's comments on the fact that the institutions are not adapted to the crisis. I guess this is absolutely correct, but that's not new. I mean, let's think of digitalisation. This discourse has been going on for more than a decade. So it's not new. It's just more obvious that we have to act soon. On Ginny and the supply chain legislation, the problem is that a lot depends on the forthcoming general election and on the composition of the future coalition government. If this is going to be a conservative dominated government, then this will not mean a lot for supply chain legislation. But even if we get it passed, the problem will be, how will it be implemented, right? In thousands of firms throughout Asia, South America, and so on. So I would not be too optimistic for this forthcoming legislation. Last but not least, on Stephen and climate change, yeah, that was an interesting decision by the Constitutional Court last week, when it decided that the distribution of burden of the consequences of climate change is very uneven. And now within less than a week, all political parties submitted their plans how these burdens or the distribution of burdens should be changed. But the impact of trade unions has been very, very small. And climate change so far, at least this is my opinion, has not been a topic for trade unions. They are more, let's say, into legislation about supply chain and digitalization quite in general. So all in all, I would share this amount of careful skepticism instead of early indicators for profound change. Okay, thanks.
And going over time, but making sure we give the Canadians their opportunity. Scott, Sean, and Daphne, do you have some final comments?
I'll make mine very quick, and so my co-authors, I see nothing on the horizon that gives me any joy in industrial relations in Canada. We can't even get our vaccines. So I don't see anything. With regard to climate change, I find, and I say this as a dean with many years of watching students, the idea that climate change will come through unions, I find unions to the next generation, unions and climate change to be orthogonal thoughts. So I see a lot of activism on climate change, a tremendous amount of activism on climate change, but I really don't see unions leading it. And there's a limit to what we can expect unions to do. We're loading a lot of things onto unions, and some of it may be diversionary, at least in a business unionism place, to expect unions to solve everything. So those are my answers. Lots of interest in climate change, not through unions.
I'll jump in quickly. And if I leave this call on a pessimistic note, I'm going to go dig a shallow grave in my backyard. So here's a small ray of hope, although you have to look far and wide for it. The response to COVID has largely been successful in jurisdictions that have been able to coordinate their institutions. And I think this bodes well for the labor movement in addressing some of the workplace problems that are arising. How's that? It's a bit of a stretch, but at least it's happy.
Thank you. So back over to you, Greg. Greg, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Thanks, Ginny. That's the expression of the year, isn't it? Going back to Tom's remarks, he and I were both in another webinar earlier in the day, Australian time, and he was talking about the need for a new social contract and the opportunity that this crisis gives us. And we've touched on this in several of these contributions. So perhaps an optimistic note is that out of a crisis, good things can come and change can take place. So let's be optimistic, but let's keep contributing to those sorts of developments in our various countries and spheres of interest in theory and in practice. But thank you very much, Ginny, for moderating the discussion. Thank you everyone for contributing by attending and putting comments in the chat and questions, and all of our panelists, and as well as Tom for being a great discussant as usual. And especially thank you to the great team at LIRA behind the scenes who make these webinars possible. And lastly, perhaps I can give a plug to the LIRA meetings coming up in June that many of us are looking forward to being present at on Zoom, although sorry, we're not going to be able to be there in practice. And also the international ILERA Congress, where Harry Katz is the president-elect, is having its World Congress a little later in June, but again, that will be only on Zoom, but there'll be opportunities for continuing these sorts of constructive dialogues, both in LIRA and in ILERA. So thank you, everyone, and good night or good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. And look forward to seeing you in person again, I hope before too long. Cheers.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining.